Hi, so let's continue talking about SLAAC and a little bit about address states and lifetimes. So here's a chart. I'm going to fill in all the blanks here for us. And I know this looks a little intimidating, but it's basically three parts. This part here, when we can't quite use an address because still making sure it's unique. This part here, preferred, where, yeah, this is a good time to use the address, create connections and that sort of thing. And then this part here, deprecated, where, well, let's start not using this address because it's eventually going to become invalid. Okay, so if you remember, we talked about certain addresses, like temporary addresses, that basically after they're created, then we can start using them. And then we want to kind of stop using them because they're going to become invalid and we're going to get another new address. Okay, so it's kind of this process, this cycle that we go through, especially with temporary addresses or with temporary addresses. Okay, so a tentative address is basically, this is when the address has first been created. This could actually be at a time when, or an address that's created statically, DHCPv6 or SLAAC, but it's going through the process of what's called duplicate address detection. This is actually a process that is not required, but recommended, and just about all operating systems, and all that I can think of, use this process. So what is the process? Well, anytime an address is created for a device, it doesn't matter, any unicast address, it doesn't matter if it's statically assigned, SLAAC, or DHCPv6, the operating system wants to go, the end device operating system wants to make sure it's unique. So let's take this link local address that was on the assigned automatically to this device. And actually we'll send out what's called a neighbor solicitation message. We've talked about these before, but that's basically like an ARP request in IPv4. It's actually saying, hey, whoever has this IPv6 address, send me your MAC address. Well, of course, it's hoping that it doesn't get a reply, which is a neighbor advertisement message. It's hoping no device will say, hey, that's my IPv6 address, here's my MAC address. So we'll wait a certain amount of time, and hopefully it won't get that neighbor advertisement message, and then it can say, hey, if I don't get that neighbor advertisement message, then I know that this address is unique. Now, these, at one time, these were required, or duplicate address detection was required. But with a 64-bit interface ID, it's only recommended now. Remember, 64-bit interface ID gives you 18 quintillion possibilities. So if the address is being generated by SLAAC using EUI64 random number, chances are that address is going to be unique. I think we're most likely going to have duplicates is when we start assigning things statically, or start assigning certain devices with a static IPv6 address. All right. So you can see this process, by the way, with debug IPv6 ND for neighbor discovery. And here we're showing it here, as a matter of fact, and we're using it here actually to see the router advertisement. So let's take a look at the valid address and the valid lifetime. So we had talked about the router advertisement sends a valid lifetime. Okay, this is actually in seconds, but it's 30 days. It's just how long this prefix is good for. Okay. But it's also the amount of time remains invalid and per first state. Okay, so I said it's 30 days. Did I say 30 seconds? I meant 30 days. Okay, so this is the amount of time it's going to be, once it gets past the duplicate address detection, that it remains in a valid state. And that means it can create new connections. And it can still be used. We'll talk about this deprecated state here in a moment. We'll talk about the difference between preferred and deprecated here in a moment. But this is all considered valid lifetime. Okay. All right. And we'll talk about the valid lifetime will always be longer than the preferred state because it's going to include the state called deprecated, which we're going to talk about here just in a moment, and then eventually become invalid. Okay, so preferred means that the address has been verified as unique through the duplicate address detection. Now the device can send and receive traffic using this address. It can use it as a source IPv6 address, and it will also accept packets with this destination IPv6 address. I should mention that when in the tentative state, that devices will not accept packets with that destination IPv6 address and will not send out packets with that source IPv6 address. Okay. But in the preferred state, we're all good. That's the real happy state right there for that address. Okay, so new connections can be initiated. Okay, so it will remain in the preferred state for a certain amount of time. Okay, 7 days is the default, and that's what's shown here in the router advertisement, the preferred state. So how long it will stay in this state, which is only 7 days. Okay. The preferred lifetime this is again the length of time that until it becomes deprecated. Okay. So eventually it's going to become deprecated. So let's talk about what deprecated is. The address is still valid. Okay, we're still in the valid state, but it's now considered deprecated, meaning that any new connections using this address should be discouraged because another temporary address is being assigned to the interface or has been assigned to the interface. So what's happening here is usually with temporary addresses, it goes, like I said, it goes through the tentative state, make sure that it's unique. Then this preferred state, we can use it, no problem, source, destination, use it as a source address, accept it as a destination. But when it becomes deprecated, it means that a new address is now it's probably gone through the tentative state and is now in the preferred status. So that's why you might see multiple temporary addresses, because you might have one that is now in the deprecated state and a new one that's now in the preferred state. And it's the preferred state which is the one that should be used when creating new connections. So why do we have this deprecated state? Well, because you might still have connections that is using that address. Okay, so it keeps it for quite a while. It says, look, I'm just eventually going to throw this away. It's going to become invalid. But there might be some existing connections, and we don't want to lose those connections. Okay, eventually the deprecated address will become invalid when the valid lifetime expires. Okay, and it should not appear as a destination or source address in a packet. So devices that you're communicating with shouldn't be using that as a destination because it's been quite a while, and any new connections would not use this address. Okay, so we can see again all of that in the router advertisement message. We've got our timers here, the prefix. All right, so more on SLAAC coming up in the next video.